Zambia signaled to the entire African continent that as a country we are ready and open for business. For the uninitiated, this was done through the ratification of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The name is Wenson Mavoro and you're watching BizWeek, and tonight I am privileged to host the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretary General, Mr. Wamkele Mene, and of course we will be discussing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement amidst COVID-19. Good evening and thank you for making time.
Thank you for inviting me.
So first things first, would like to know, we know that Zambia was one of those countries that joined the bandwagon and took the bold step to be able to ratify the agreement. So just give us an update in terms of ratification on the African continent of this important agreement.
This is the fastest agreement to be ratified under the African Union. We now have 37 countries that have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. One country is yet to do what we call depositing the instrument of ratification, and that is the DRC. But 37 countries is a very, very strong signal and a very positive signal that these countries accept the legal obligations for reducing barriers to trade, reducing barriers to investment, and adhering to a single set of rules for trade and investment on the African continent, something that we did not have before at this scale. We had SADC, we had EAC, ECOWAS, but for the first time, we now have a continental market that we can be proud of as Africans.
Brilliant progress over there. And we know that we're living in the times of COVID-19 where, we have now terminologies such as the new normal, becoming very familiar and sort of defining the kind of lives that we live. So how has COVID-19 affected implementation of this agreement that is making progress on the continent?
Well, absolutely, it has had a very, very negative effect. Let me start with the macroeconomic impact on the whole of Africa. You may be aware that for the first time in 30 years, Sub-Saharan Africa is in a recession. Sub-Saharan Africa experienced negative growth of about 3.5% as a result of COVID-19. And of course, the services sector was very, very hard hit. Tourism, the airline industry experienced losses of up to $30 billion by estimates of the African Union. And we also experienced a decline in our export markets. Exports declined by up to 32%. So from a macroeconomic standpoint, the impact was materially adverse for Africa. We, of course, no country can trade in those circumstances. No region can trade in those circumstances. So we had to postpone the start of trading under the AfCFTA rules from the 1st of July 2020 to the 1st of January 2021. At that time, last year, at the height of the pandemic, July, out of 55 countries, 42 in the African continent were either in a full or partial lockdown. So there would have been no credibility to say that we started trading on a date when borders were actually closed. So we had to take that into account and advise the heads of states that let us give a few more months for COVID-19 to subside. So the impact was very, very negative. But I think that we now, through this agreement, we now have an opportunity for a recovery which would be driven by this agreement, implementation of this agreement, because through boosting intra-Africa trade, we have the opportunity to contribute to economic activity on the African continent.
Talking about recovery, Your Excellency, I know that it is the agenda of the majority of African countries, and Zambia inclusive. Our 2021 national budget is actually focused on achieving economic recovery that is on the backbone of the private sector. So how crucial is this agreement to be able to ensure that African countries do, achieve economic recovery?
Oh, it's absolutely critical because for economies to recover, whether it's a national economy or regional economy, you have to grow. Your exports must increase. Your investment, foreign direct investment into your country must also increase. So it's absolutely tied to implementation of the AfCFTA. By boosting intra-Africa trade, as I said earlier, we would be contributing to economic activity in a particular country or a particular region. So we see this as absolutely a critical factor in Africa's recovery. If you recall, before the onset of COVID-19, Africa was on a modest growth rate of about 3.5% by the estimates of the African Development Bank. And of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in 2019, 6 were in Africa. Not nearly enough for us as Africa to create millions and millions of jobs, but it was moderate growth, second fastest growing region after Southeast Asia at that time. So we now have a much more bleak economic circumstance that has been occasioned by COVID-19. And so we believe that boosting intra-Africa trade, if you expand your business from SADC into West Africa or North Africa, that contributes to Africa's economic activity, where we have industrial development that is accelerating as a result of establishment of value chains across the African continent. That contributes to Africa's economic recovery. So it's absolutely a critical recovery tool for the continent.
How essential are regional trading blocs such as COMESA, ECOWAS, to the successful implementation of this agreement?
The regional economic communities are the building blocks of the African Continental Free Trade Area. In fact, yesterday, when I met with Her Excellency, the Secretary General of COMESA, that is precisely the issue that we discussed, the importance, the foundational importance of regional economic communities. We had a similar conversation last year with the President of ECOWAS. So there is a continued role for regional economic communities in building the AfCFTA. There are regional economic communities that have had very, very good success, such as COMESA, not only in liberalizing trade and boosting intra-regional trade, but also in establishing the support pillars that make a free trade area a success, such as trade facilitation, trade finance, the establishment of the bank, the Trade and Development Bank by COMESA. Incredibly successful this regional economic community has been. So we don't intend that there will be a replacement of regional economic communities because we build upon their successes. We will be complementary in our relationship with them. We will collaborate with regional economic communities. Ultimately, the objective is to boost intra-Africa trade. By the year 2035, we want to have doubled intra-Africa trade. In order to get to that point, we have to build on what the regional economic communities have been able to achieve. Granted, they are at different levels of success, these regional economic communities, but nonetheless, we have to work with them, we have to collaborate, and we have to be in a complementary working relationship with them.
What kind of leverage will this agreement give Africa when it comes to the global trade platform?
I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is not a customs union. So we are not going to negotiate as the AfCFTA with a third party, with China or the US or whomsoever. That is something that is further down the line. Our job is to consolidate the market, to integrate it, to reduce barriers to trade and investment, to establish a single set of rules. That is what we seek to achieve. If you look at the market size of Africa, 1.2 billion people, a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars, which is projected by the year 2035 to be close to 8 trillion United States dollars. If we want to be regionally and globally competitive, we have to start looking inward. How do we enhance Africa's value-added productive capacity? How do we make sure that from an industrial standpoint that we advance and that we move away from what I call a colonial economic model of being primary exporters of primary commodities? I think that should be the focus, not how we consolidate this market in relation to third parties. That is something that can only be discussed in the context of a customs union, and Africa is not a customs union yet. The objective is that down the line we do become a customs union, but I think for now the immediate task is for us to consolidate the AfCFTA, implement it successfully, and grow Africa's economy by being regionally and nationally very, very competitive.
Zambia's business environment is largely informal, and one would ask how opportunities that the AfCFTA will bring can be leveraged by the majority of these micro entrepreneurs that comprise these sectors.
Well, the point I've been making since I was elected by the heads of states is that we've got to learn our lessons from past mistakes. If you look at trade agreements around the world, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they have benefited large corporations and they have benefited the elite. And that is why, in part, we saw a backlash in the United States with the former administration saying, let us get out of NAFTA. NAFTA sent jobs from the US to Mexico. We have seen that type of nationalist rhetoric also in some parts of Europe, blaming trade agreements. And that may be an unfair criticism. But what is a fair criticism of trade agreements, which we have to confront head on, is that they don't always deliver inclusive growth, whether we're talking across countries or in country. Trade agreements have typically delivered growth for already the corporations that are in a position to access the new market that the trade agreement presents. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure we create opportunities for inclusive growth within the AfCFTA, and we have to do that by working and creating opportunities with small, medium enterprises, the informal sector, as you have said. For example, at the moment we are in conversations with commercial banks around the African continent with a view to creating a trade finance facility specifically for small, medium enterprises. So that if you are a small, medium enterprise in Livingston and you want to access a market in Nigeria, we as the Secretariat can be in a position to facilitate that market opening and market access on your behalf through this trade finance facility and the digital enabling platforms that will also support the implementation of the trade agreement. Similarly, with young Africans, with young people and women in trade, we have to take affirmative action to make sure that we create these opportunities. The big corporations on the African continent, I keep saying it, they don't need me, they don't need us. We open a market, the next day the big corporations are in the new market. But the people that really do need us, with whom this agreement will resonate in the sense of inclusivity and inclusive growth and development, small medium enterprises, young people, and women in trade. So we have to complement already the policies that exist in national governments across the African continent for the purpose of uplifting and creating opportunities for young people and women and small medium enterprises.
From your submission, Your Excellency, obviously it is a no-brainer that industrialization is some form of vantage when it comes to the AfCFTA.
Yeah.
But there are some concerns that, less industrialized economies may become dumping grounds. So what kind of support is the Secretariat offering to prevent this, or at strategic level, what kind of, mitigating measure is being put in place?
Let me answer that question in two ways. First is the technical legal response. We have in the agreement already built in safeguards to prevent that from happening. We have anti-dumping measures. We have measures to prevent the surges in imports. We have measures to prevent goods that are exported rather, but that are subsidized. All of these things we have infant industry protection provisions. We have rules of origin. All of these rules and these safeguards are built into the agreement to prevent precisely what you've mentioned, the dumping of goods from one country to the other within the AfCFTA. Trade is allowable within the AfCFTA. The transit of goods is allowable. That is precisely why we have this agreement. But it has to be done in a way that is fair. Now, let me also respond in a different way. There will be countries who will be immediate beneficiaries of this agreement. And that is, I don't think anybody can deny that. And these are countries that are already relatively industrialized, as you alluded. But the challenge that we have, again, to confront head-on is how do we bring countries who today don't have the industrial capacity, the manufacturing capacity, how do we bring those countries on board to benefit from the agreement in future? And this is the point I keep making about inclusive growth and inclusive benefits, not only across countries, but in country. But we know from experience of other regions, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world, that a trade agreement can actually deliver benefits even to countries who 20 years earlier were not in a position to compete. Let's take the example of Lesotho. When we negotiated the SADC trade protocol, Lesotho had a fear of being overrun by South Africa, not being able to compete, and so on. But today, Lesotho is part of the value chain of automobiles that are being exported from South Africa to the United States under AGOA, and also to Europe under the Economic Partnership Agreement. Same thing with Botswana and Lesotho. They are part of that automobiles value chain. This has created and fostered industrialization in these countries. In Lesotho, it has created over 100,000 jobs, mainly for women, and has enabled Lesotho to be quite competitive, particularly in auto components. East Africa, similar thing. Uganda at some point was very worried about Kenya in a trade arrangement. But now Uganda is competitive in many, many areas. But these things don't happen by themselves. You have to work very hard to create the value chains in which countries can begin to be part of. Some countries will advance on the value chain and leave space for others. But you've got to create those opportunities. You have to create those value chains. They don't happen by themselves. We have also seen the same phenomenon in Asia, particularly during the 60s and the 70s, during the time of the so-called Asian tigers. So I don't think we need to do anything different on the African continent except to work hard to create these value chains that will enable Africa to advance on industrial development across the African continent, and not just a few countries in Africa who are already industrialized. That is the challenge that we have to confront.
Different jurisdictions at the moment are rolling out various stimulus initiatives to be able to keep economic activity flowing, as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic that has disrupted, even the value chains that you have mentioned. To what extent are these stimulus initiatives key, to be able to ensuring that the implementation of the AfCFTA is enhanced?
Different countries are taking different monetary policy measures, fiscal policy measures, and of course, many countries on the African continent simply don't have the monetary policy space, the fiscal policy space to provide these significantly large bailouts. The United States is, by some accounts, is now close to $10 trillion worth of a stimulus package. The Europeans are at about 800 billion euros. Very, very few countries on the African continent can do that. And so we have to consider other tools of reigniting dynamism in our economies, whether it is the airline industry or agro-processing or indeed financial services. We've got to look at other ways in which we can reignite economic growth on the African continent. And that's why this agreement is so important, because in the context of intra-Africa barriers to trade, you are not going to reach the growth figures that you require as a country or as a continent, because our economies, our countries are simply too small. We don't have large enough national economies to be able to trade ourselves out of the condition that has been occasioned by COVID-19 as a single country or indeed as a region. Our national economies are too small, our regional economies are simply too small. There's not a single country on the African continent that is large enough on its own that it can survive without the other economies on the African continent. The interconnectedness of Africa's economy has got to be appreciated. And so I believe that this agreement offers us precisely that opportunity.
As we get to wrap up this conversation, Your Excellency, debt is becoming a very common phenomenon on the African continent, and concerns, with regards this debt are very obvious, and we know that our Oriental counterparts, are very much involved in this mix. To what extent is debt going to affect implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Well, the issue of debt relief, the African Union has pronounced on it, particularly in the context of COVID-19. The African Union has been at the fore of the previous chairperson of the African Union Assembly of Heads of States and the current one have been at the fore of making a call to the international community for debt relief. We saw some debt relief coming out of the G20, but of course it is nowhere near the extent to which we want to see. And that is because we know the impact it may have, the impact that debt may have on a country's ability to export, to create export opportunities, the impact that it has on the capital account, and so on. So it is an important issue. It is something that the African Union has been paying attention to, as I said, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Lastly, Your Excellency, we've seen, the Brexit situation escalating, and we know that yes, there's COVID-19 now, but that agenda is very much active, on the table. How different will the African story be if the vanguards of initiatives such as the AfCFTA are experiencing this kind of phenomenon?
Well, we're actually going the opposite direction. We are not disintegrating, we are integrating. I'm not for a moment suggesting Europe is disintegrating, but we are moving the opposite direction. We are reducing barriers to intra-Africa trade. We are reducing protectionism within the African continent, whether it is trade, investment. This is what those rules seek to achieve. And one day, Africa will become a customs union. And I believe we will see that in our lifetime. But what this points to, the significant progress that we've made as Africans in the last few years, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, is that actually, as the world is engaging in the so-called trade wars, Africa is breaking down barriers to trade within Africa. And as the world is putting barriers to investments coming in from other countries, we are reducing those barriers. We want to encourage intra-Africa investment into productive sectors across the African continent. So I think we should be proud of what we have achieved. Of course, there are legitimate questions about why it took so long. 60 years after colonialism, why only now? Those questions are quite legitimate. I'm not in a position to answer them. I was not there 40 to 30 years ago. But I think it is very important to recognize that we have made significant progress in market integration on the African continent.
Thank you for making time, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My guest this evening has been the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And of course, we were discussing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement amidst the COVID-19. Is there a hope for economic progress and emancipation for the much natural resource endowed African continent? The answer is yes. And one of the two that makes it possible is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.